The exclusive from Medidas Cautelares with Miguel Ángel Pérez is confirmed. The Attorney General orders that no sentence reduction be sought for Víctor de Aldama so that he does not go to prison. Let's begin. Welcome to a new edition of Medidas Cautelares with Miguel Ángel Pérez. What a day! A late-night Medidas Cautelares session with Miguel Ángel Pérez as we are making this video after a very intense day, a day of trial, the second to last one, in principle, no less. The main figure today was the former Minister of Transport, José Luis Ábalos, who testified at the Supreme Court for practically 7 hours. Quite something, right? We were there. And pay attention because the exclusive news I told you about earlier has been confirmed. The Attorney General Teresa Peramato, under orders from Pedro Sánchez, has instructed the Chief Anti-Corruption Prosecutor, Alejandro Luzón, not to request a reduction in the prison sentence for Víctor de Aldama. Pay attention to this information. I'm going to tell you everything that happened in this statement by José Luis Ábalos and also what consequences this decision by the prosecutor's office imposed by Prime Minister Pedro Sánchez has. Let's get to it. But as always, I remind you, if you haven't done so already, remember to subscribe to the Medidas Cautelares channel with Miguel Ángel Pérez. We've already surpassed 128,000 subscribers and we're gaining a lot of momentum in recent days. And now let's get right into analyzing José Luis Ábalos' testimony. We could say that, broadly speaking, the former Minister of Transport has presented himself as a saintly man before the Supreme Court. Ábalos, in the end, has only answered the Chief Anti-Corruption Prosecutor Alejandro Luzón, Koldo García's defense lawyer, and his own lawyer, but he did not want to answer either the private prosecutors or Víctor de Aldama's lawyer. What has José Luis Ábalos said? Well, he has practically distanced himself completely from everything. In other words, in line with what we already knew about him throughout the investigation, where in the hearings where he spoke he denied everything, well, he has continued along those same lines. That is to say, he has presented himself as someone who has not committed any kind of illegality, he has denied any kickbacks tied to the masks, and he has distanced himself from getting the prostitute Jessica Rodríguez a job in the public company Ineco. Exatec. Basically, what he has come to say is that with Jessica Rodríguez, well, he had an extramarital relationship with her. And that to avoid a public scandal, he kept giving her those benefits and so on. And obviously, in his opinion, Jessica Rodríguez must have been coerced to testify in the Supreme Court. He hasn't wanted to say by whom, but he has hinted that it could be by Víctor de Aldama. And he says then that Jessica Rodríguez said she didn't work at Ineco or Traxatec, but that she got paid without being asked about it during those appearances in the Supreme Court. So what he basically said is that she was coerced when that decision was made. José Luis Ábalos also said that he was the one who gave the political order to buy 8 million masks through government channels instead of 4 because it was necessary. Because it was a moment of urgency and he was, well, a national hero who came to save all Spaniards, and that's why he gave that order for 8 million. It should be said that Ábalos has maintained the omerta, the so-called law of silence, not a mafia one, in which he has completely protected in his statement Prime Minister Pedro Sánchez and the Socialist Party itself. He hasn't attacked them in any way. Ábalos protected them to the very end. What he has basically said is that it's true he was reimbursed in cash for expenses because that was the party's culture, the party's tradition within the Socialist Party until 2021, and from 2021 onwards things changed. Ábalos has also said, for example, that Koldo García used to pay many of his personal expenses in advance and that even today he owes 33,000 euros to Koldo García. And there was also a curious moment during that statement when he was asked about the famous folios. As you know, according to the UFO, it was a figurative way of talking about money. Well, according to José Luis Ábalos, that's completely false. He has tried at all times to attack the UCO, delegitimize their reports, and say that there was practically a bias from the beginning to find him guilty of everything. And what they're going to say is that the sheets of paper, they really were just sheets of paper, because he's from a paper-based culture. paper, and that he likes to make his dossiers, and that they use a lot of pages. And when they told him to deliver sheets of paper to the minister's house, it wasn't money, it was really just pages. But anyway, the most important thing is that José Luis Ábalos, as I said, didn't want to start a fight either against Pedro Sánchez, whatever the reason, or against the Socialist Party itself. That was the statement from José Luis Ábalos. And then, well, the documentary evidence arrived where the parties presented and even read that annex. They presented some documents as evidence for and against. We were able to listen to the famous audio from that recording provided by the defense of Victor Aldama and José Antonio Choclán, where they talked about the little deals. Back in around 2019, it was about the famous SEPI building, where kickbacks were going to be pocketed. Suddenly, Begoña Gómez got involved to do business with the Instituto de Empresa, and an offer to buy the property from Aldama himself was withdrawn. And when it seemed like everything was about to end, they arrived. The moment of the conclusions, they became final, but the important moment was when those provisional conclusions became final, in which the parties have to say if their defense or prosecution filings need to be modified in any way. Well, the scoop first reported by Medidas Cautelares with Miguel Ángel Pérez and Libertad Digital yesterday was confirmed. By the way, the media hasn't picked up on it. And suddenly, at 6 in the evening, everyone starts publishing it when we had already released it at 2 in the morning. Don't they read Libertad Digital or watch Medidas Cautelares with Miguel Ángel Pérez? That's their problem. But the point is that indeed the chief anti-corruption prosecutor Alejandro Luzón has arrived following the orders imposed by the Attorney General Teresa Peramato. He said that there was no modification in his provisional charging filings in which, well, he would have to point out Victor Aldama's cooperation with the justice system, his remorse and all the information that has helped to prove the criminal acts. Could a reduction in the requested sentence be considered for those crimes of criminal organization or repeated bribery by 1 or 2 degrees? And Luzón has had to follow the orders imposed by the Attorney General, who in turn has received orders from the government of Pedro Sánchez, and say that they weren't going to request a reduction in the prison sentence for Victor Aldama. I already told you that it wasn't necessary for the parties to request it, obviously. When the prosecutor's office requests it, it's more powerful. But the private prosecution requested it, the PP's lawyer, Alberto Duran, on behalf of all the private prosecutors. He has indeed requested a reduction of up to 2 degrees for Aldama's prison sentence. That's right. At the trial start, the anti-corruption prosecutor's office requested 7 years for those 2 crimes. And a 2-degree reduction was considered by the private prosecution, with even a 1-degree reduction being enough. Then Aldama would not go to prison, which is why it's very important for the Supreme Court to at least grant a 1-degree reduction. It doesn't have to be 2, but with just 1, Aldama would not go to prison. The exclusive part that I wanted to tell you in this video as well, because this video is really thorough, I have to tell you that right now the chief anti-corruption prosecutor, Alejandro Luzón, he is obviously thinking about it in his final written conclusions, in his closing argument. He must follow the instructions of Teresa Peramato, the state's attorney general and his hierarchical superior, because the prosecutor's office is a hierarchical institution. But Luzón is considering in the presentation of his final report, which will finally be on Wednesday, because an extra day has been given for the parties to study those final reports. So on Wednesday, Luzón. He asks if the state attorney general's decision applies here. No, he's not going to say it like that, obviously, about not asking for a reduction of prison time for Aldama, but I do notice it because orally, the chief anti-corruption prosecutor, Alejandro Luzón, can express it, even if later in his written statement he has to say what the Attorney General has ordered him to. We'll see what happens in that last day of the trial, on Wednesday. But just so you see that the things we talk about on Medidas Cautelares actually happen, right? This edition of Medidas Cautelares with Miguel Ángel Pérez. Thank you for your attention. And you already know, you can become members as a chosen member for less than €3 a month or as a supreme member for less than €7 a month. Also important, we are going to dedicate today's program to our new member, since we have a new member among the chosen ones. His name is Jesus, so this one is for you, Jesus. Thank you very much for joining the Medidas Cautelares Members Club with Miguel Ángel Pérez, and you already know that you can also make your own contributions. financial contributions whenever you can, whatever amount you can, so that this community can continue sharing and informing about everything that other media and, of course, other channels don't tell you. Collaboration via Visium at 627-556-370, 627-556-370. The most important thing, as I always say, is that this information reaches everyone because information is power. See you soon.